Hey guys, so unfortunately I won't be able to make it to class today, but I wanted to do my paper presentation through this video. Hope you guys enjoy it, and you can follow along with the worksheet. The person I researched for my paper was Charles Finney, and I focused in on his new measures, which were considered very controversial at that time. He was a revivalist theologian, and he was known for his revivals. His revival methods were often seen as controversial. His ministry took place around the 1800s, and that's when he was most influential. And these new methods that he implemented were often known as new measures. And many would often oppose him and criticize him and write letters against him, and because they disapproved of his methods. Um, some of these methods were the anxious seat, which I'll be talking about later, the protracted meetings, and lastly, the involvement of lay, lay persons and women in the ministry. Um, so just to get a little background of Finney and how he grew up, we can see that in his life he grew up in the Presbyterian Church, and they emphasized the Calvinistic idea. One of the 5 points of Calvinism. They emphasized um, unconditional election. Unconditional election basically said that uh, it was God who chose and elected the people, and the people could not really choose God. And so, therefore, the individual or the sinner had no obligation to really take that decision to, follow Christ. It would have to be through the power of the Spirit. Some divine intervention would need to take place in order for the individual to make that decision. And Finney realized that because of such beliefs that people would just go on sinning for long periods of time, and they would say that their time hasn't come yet, that God's timing for them has not come yet, God hasn't elected them yet, and they would just wait for that specific time. But how Finney differed in his theology was that he believed in a conditional election, more of a Arminian view, which emphasized more of the individual's responsibility, or and gave an opportunity for the individual to actually take a stance and say, you know what, I'm going to follow Christ. And these opportunities were brought about through his various new measures that he implemented throughout his ministry. The first new measure that he implemented, as I mentioned earlier, was the anxious seat. This was a seat that would be placed, or a bench that would be placed up in the front of the congregation. They would be vacated for the very purpose that at the end of the sermon, if there was any individual in the audience that was feeling convicted of their sin, or they felt like God was dealing with them through the sermon, that they could stand up and come forward and take a seat on this anxious bench or anxious seat. And this provided an opportunity for the individuals to actually make an immediate decision instead of waiting or going home and then waiting on God to actually intervene. This instead allowed the individuals to make a public display or a public decision, or a public confession of their new step of faith that they're taking in Christ. And although we don't see much of an anxious seat in churches today, we do see various other methods, such as altar calls, that we might be familiar with. And it usually stems from Finney's Finney's theology of an anxious seat. Also, throughout history, we can even see, even after Finney, D.L. Moody, he also used something similar called the inquiry room. This inquiry room was where people could go after the sermons and speak to one of the volunteers there who would help them in their conversion process, and speak to them if they were feeling convicted of sin. Finney once said that religion is something to do, not something to wait for. And that was really important because it goes against what the Calvinistic or the old school Presbyterian tradition taught, because they said that you had to wait for God to intervene. But what Finney is saying here is that religion is something to do, so it's our duty to act. Um, this is similar. The second controversial new measure that was set in place by um, Finney was called the protracted meetings. These protracted meetings were basically uh, these long meetings uh, that would take place day after day. It would start off as like 3 days, consecutive days, or 4 days, or a week. Sometimes it even prolonged to like months. And basically, the purpose of these protracted meetings were so that people would be awakened, and that there would be great conversions taking place. Many number of conversions. One of the statistics that were taken was that within 60 years in New York State churches alone, there were about 8,000 newly baptized converts within the 60 years. And that was a huge impact just within New York itself. But these protracted meetings took place in many other parts of America. And finally, the um, last new measure that I talked about in the paper was the involvement of laypersons and women in ministry. Finney strongly encouraged laypersons and women to be involved in ministry. In fact, he said um, that ministry would be hard, that revivals would be hard to be done without the help of women or laypersons in the ministry, because oftentimes, since the church did not teach that the priesthood of all believers, or that laypersons could be involved in carrying out church activities, the pastor or the minister was left alone doing all the work. And because of that, they would get burned out, and they weren't able to have a successful revivals or meetings. But Finney actually said that one of the some of the greatest revivals that he experienced was the ones that were mainly led by laypersons and women. And so it that this was such a big uh, change or a turn in society, a pivotal point, because during that time, women were not even considered equal to men in American history. Women were considered a second class citizens. They wouldn't normally pursue any further education, or they wouldn't pursue a professional career. Instead, they were to remain in the house, and their influence would be just within the four corners of their home, and wouldn't really leave their house. So to be able to be an influence in the church, and in converting other people to Christianity, this gave women much more greater role and value in society. So, just by looking at all the things, the three things that I mentioned, the anxious seat, the protracted meetings, and the involvement of laypersons and women in ministry, um, Finney had a pretty tremendous impact on American evangelical Christianity as we see it today. And not only was his reforms religious, but we could also say that it was he also brought about some social reform, especially in terms of allowing layperson women in ministry. So uh, overall, Finney's impact has been positive, and we can see the effects of his ministry even in our Christianity today. So I hope you were all able to learn a few things about Charles Finney, and hope you enjoyed this video.